Hey World Civilizations, Mr. Lassiter with you, and in this video we're going to be looking at the spread of the Industrial Revolution and what we call the Second Industrial Revolution, or kind of the second half or second part of this social, economic, and technological change. So our video goals here: how and where did the Industrial Revolution spread after it began in Britain? We want to try to understand what was the second Industrial Revolution and why we might call it the second versus the first Industrial Revolution. And then how did Europe come to dominate the world economy during this Industrial Revolution? And we're going to start with the map here to the right that shows manufacturing and industrial areas in Europe by about the year 1870, when the Second Industrial Revolution begins. And when we finish, I want you to look at a map that shows industrialization in Europe in 1914 at the start of World War I, and see how it has changed. Still here in 1870 we see quite a few railroads connecting all of Europe, but relatively few large manufacturing centers. But pay attention to where these areas are concentrated. The United Kingdom, Belgium, parts of Germany, and Prussia. So let's get started with the spread of the Industrial Revolution in Europe. Keep in mind that by the mid-19th century, Great Britain was the world's first and richest kind of industrial nation. They produced half of the world's coal and manufactured goods, and more cotton than the rest of Europe combined, cotton goods. The Industrial Revolution, which I've abbreviated IR throughout, spreads to the rest of Europe at different times and speeds. First it goes to Belgium, then France, then to the German states. And in those new regions where the Industrial Revolution is spreading, it's spreading there because governments are actively encouraging the development of industry. So, for example, in the German states, the government works with universities and with industries themselves to fund and support the development of industry. These nations and their governments provided funds for roads, canals, and railroads, all things that would help transportation of goods to and from the markets, and would improve their efforts to industrialize. In North America, we really see the Industrial Revolution taking off in the United States in the 1800s. From 1800 to 1860, we see a huge population growth in the United States, partially due to immigration to the United States from places like Europe, as people search for factory work. Of course, railroads in the United States grew, as you can see on this map. In 1830, there was very little railroad, very few miles of railroad, but by 1870, 53,000 miles, and by 1900, over 195,000 miles of railroad track in the country. So railroads, along with canals and steamboats, make transportation of people and especially goods easier through the United States. The most important development, though, are railroads. In the United States, most of the people who lived in the country, as the same in Europe, were rural populations, people who farmed and lived out in the countryside. But as factory jobs opened up and there was more work in cities, we see a large growth in American cities as people begin moving to industrial centers. Women also entered the workforce in this time, especially in the Northeast in the textile industries, much as the same as we see in places like Britain. The second Industrial Revolution that I was talking about earlier comes about in about 1870. So this is different from the first revolution, really, in terms of what is being produced and how it's being produced. The first Industrial Revolution had given rise to new ways to make textiles, the beginning of railroad building, the use of iron in building, and the use of coal to power factories. In the second industrial revolution, we're really going to see steel instead of iron, chemicals come into play, electricity begin to power these factories, and the use of petroleum or oil, which would lead the way in building new industries. For example, here on the right you see Paris, the city of lights, in the year 1900, which was electrified, of course. So let's talk about some of the things that characterize the second industrial revolution, starting with new products. And the first and most notable change was the substitution of steel for iron. Steel had been around for quite some time, but it was very expensive to produce and hard to produce large quantities of. Steel was stronger and more malleable than iron. You could bend it in different ways. It was you didn't need as much because it was stronger, so you could make lighter ships and steamships, etc. So it was ideal for building machines, engines, weapons. But when new processes come about in the 18th and 19th centuries to make steel, a lot more quantities of steel for cheap, that was a game changer. And so things like the Bessemer process, which you see pictured to the right, really make steel one of the major ingredients, so to speak, of the Industrial Revolution. Also, electricity becomes the new form of energy. So we have the first practical generators developed in the 1870s, and by 1910 we see generating plants that electrified cities, factories, and communication. Some of these were generated by coal-fired plants, and then hydroelectric dams even are developed by the early 1900s. There are tons of major inventions in the Industrial Revolution, especially as we get to the Second Industrial Revolution, and these are a few of them. Some of the most important ones involved communication, so the telegraph and Morse code in the 1830s, the telephone in the 1870s. So communication becomes much easier throughout the world. Also, as we just mentioned, the Bessemer process for creating cheap steel. But other inventions which are extremely important, for example, the light bulb, the first practical motor car, of course, 1903, the first plane flight by Wilbur and Orville Wright, right here in North Carolina at Kitty Hawk. So these inventions, these new ways of powering the Industrial Revolution, these new materials, really to create new patterns that we see in the Second Industrial Revolution, including the idea that industry continues to grow at that rapid pace, at that allows more goods to be produced and therefore produced more cheaply. And so we're going to see increased sales of manufactured goods. After 1870, wages for workers begin to rise and the price of goods begin to fall. This will lead to in industrialized areas, a higher standard of living. By 1900, really, in Europe, we see two economic zones. The industrialized core of Europe, which included the United Kingdom, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Western Austria-Hungary, northern parts of Italy, and parts of France. But we also see agricultural regions, which was basically areas in Eastern Europe and Russia. The industrialized core are going to provide those manufactured goods, and the agricultural regions providing raw materials and growing food for the whole of Europe. Ultimately, what we see developing in the 19th century is a true world economy, where railroads and steamships aid in transporting goods throughout the world. European nations also invest abroad in developing railroads in places where they need them. For example, the British developing railroads in India or South Africa in order to get raw materials to coastlines so they can be shipped to industrial centers. We see electrical plants, modern banking developing around the world to assist with this trade. Also, in addition to getting raw materials from foreign markets or foreign countries, European countries are able then to sell their goods to those places. And we talked about that quite a bit in class with the industrialized country game that we played. But ultimately, we see by the 20th century, Europe is going to dominate the world economy. No longer are they looking to other countries to provide things. European industrialization is providing more than enough for the world at large and making Europeans a lot of money. This map shows that worldwide trade. Each red line here shows major steamship routes in 1900. And so we truly see an interconnected global world, not just across the Atlantic or across the Mediterranean or the Indian Oceans, but also across the Pacific, to basically all corners of the world. Make sure that you can answer the questions to these video goals. Make sure when you come into class Monday that you are prepared to discuss the Industrial Revolution and industrialization in Europe in the 19th century. Have a good one. And as I get back to watching Star Trek, live long and prosper.